Yeah, what are your thoughts on the likelihood of, I guess, of AI taking over the world, becoming super productive, and you can just print robots to replace, to fix demographics? Do you see that as a likely outcome or potential outcome?
Well, I think it's a variable. I don't think it's that utopian. I think the offshoring and automation of the past 40 years was a very powerful disinflationary force, right? So instead of Americans in like Detroit making cars, you offset that to Japan, which at the time, especially back then, was cheaper. And instead of making, sneakers in the U.S., you make them in China, in Vietnam, and Bangladesh, and all that. And you automate it, so one person can do the work of four people because it's automated. We've already automated a lot of blue collar work, or put it into cheaper labor markets. And basically, what AI can do, I think, in the investable time horizon. So I'm not going to think 20 years from now for AI, but let's say the investable time horizon of 5 to 10 years, um, it can start to chip away at white collar work. It can one white collar employee can do the work of more because they have a bunch of AI assistants kind of automating some of their repeated tasks, um, and kind of offsetting some of their analytics or their thinking, or things like that. Um, a lawyer doing legal research, having AI helper, it makes things a lot, more efficient. So I think that we could see a similar phenomenon to white collar labor as we saw to blue collar labor. Robots are an energy intensive, challenging thing, right? I think that's robots in kind of the natural world is a longer term thing, but I think that the automation of white collar work is a lower hanging fruit for now.
Okay. And yeah, I guess the challenge would be, there's all these new innovations which require more energy, and we're moving to a energy system which is variable. It's not sort of fixed, so that makes it quite hard to, I guess, to predict the pricing. And I know it's happening in Europe currently, where there's very high negative prices because there's so much renewable energy in the system. So I think it's going to be a very interesting few years to see how that affects investments moving forward.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, this whole period is probably going to be more energy intensive because the latest technical trend over the past 15 years was towards social media and mobile internet, which is not particularly energy intensive. Just it's software APIs. It's fairly low bandwidth. It's fairly low hardware intensity, and it offsets some real world things. Like, you don't really need to buy a printer scanner anymore if you can just scan things on your phone and sign things online. So you're actually offsetting some other things. You fold like 30 different products into your phone, and you use those other things less or not at all. So it's kind of a displacement effect. Whereas if we start really building up a lot of compute resources, that is more hardware and energy focused, intense. And so I do think that, that there's going to be pretty significant energy demands over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And there's going to be, I mean, that's an investment opportunity, but it's also a risk because that's a source of inflation if energy supply does not stay ahead. And I think that's a pretty big risk. And in Europe's case, I mean, at first glance, negative energy prices sound like a good thing, right? It sounds like abundant. But Europe has higher average electricity prices than most other places, even though they also have a pretty high frequency of negative energy. Basically, you can think of negative energy pricing as inefficiency. It means you're producing electricity precisely when you don't want it, right? So it's not about how much electricity we produce. It's about producing electricity when and where we want it because we can't just teleport it for free anywhere, right? When we wake up, we all use a lot of electricity, and then when people like commute and go to work, they might use less electricity at home, and it's those workplaces that are on. And then in the evening, they come back and use a lot more electricity again, and then they go to bed and they use less electricity both at work and at home. And so the system has to accommodate all that changing time. And then in addition, there are certain seasons that use more. Like in Egypt, for example, like electricity usage like doubles in the summer because everybody has their air conditioning on. So the system has to be built to accommodate that season while also figuring out what to do with that spare capacity in the less hot months. So they need a way to like export some of their electricity if possible, or consume less of it. Um, and so basically, negative energy pricing is a measure of inefficiency. It says that you're doing something wrong. In the United States, if you look at our negative energy pricing, it's increased over the past 10 years, and it's concentrated in the middle of the country because that's where we have the most like wind and solar capacity. So like, West Texas and, the states that are north of Texas, kind of there's like a wind corridor And we have that's where we have a lot of renewable. Like Texas kind of leapfrogged California in terms of solar and wind. But the problem is that it's not well used because it's producing energy in the middle of the day when you don't really need it. And batteries are material intensive and expensive. And that's part of why in the U.S., like Texas is such a big Bitcoin mining hub, because they can come in and say, well, I mean, we'll buy at any time of day where it's like nearly free, and we'll shut off during the peak periods because we're like the most flexible, you know, source of energy demand. And so it kind of fills in the gap. But ideally, the grid itself is just designed so that it doesn't produce too much negative price electricity. 'Cause that's just it's electricity produced at the wrong time, which is fine if electricity overall is cheap and reliable. But if it's either expensive and reliable or cheap and unreliable, those are both bad scenarios. You want to be cheap, reliable, um, which is not the case in Europe currently. And so that hurts their industry. That hurts their car manufacturing and other heavy industries. And it kind of further accelerates the move of that toward China. One thing that kind of went under the radar in financial world is how quickly China ramped up their auto production, and not like a lot of the focus on their electric vehicles, but it's actually their ICE vehicles. Um, so literally in like a 3 or 4 year period, China went from marginal exporter to the biggest car exporter in the world. They passed Germany, they passed South Korea, they passed Japan in terms of the number of cars exported. And like in the United States, we don't see it. We're completely blind to it because nobody drives Chinese cars here. But when you go to Egypt, you see Chinese cars all over the road, and you didn't see that 5 years ago. When you go to many other emerging markets, you see Chinese cars everywhere. They're now one of the largest players, and that's partially because they have the energy. Like China produces by far the most electricity in the world. They can run all these energy intensive production facilities, and that's less viable in Europe now than it used to be. In the United States, it's still rather viable, but we have other problems related to our manufacturing, mainly more financial related. And so yeah, the energy piece is a really big component.